Reply to the sixth set of objections. 1. It is indeed true that no one can be certain that he thinks or that he exists unless he knows what thought is, and what existence is. This is not to say that it requires a knowledge which is reflective or which is acquired through demonstration, much less a knowledge of reflective knowledge, through which one knows that one knows, and again knows that one knows that one knows, and so on ad infinitum. This sort of knowledge can never be had about anything. Rather, it is quite sufficient that one knows it by that inner knowledge which always precedes reflective knowledge. This inner knowledge, in the case of thought and existence, is innate in all men in such a way that we could not really be without it, even if perhaps we are overwhelmed by preconceived opinions and are attentive more to words than to their meanings, and thus could imagine that we do not have such knowledge. Thus, when someone notices that he is thinking, and that it follows from this that he exists, even though perhaps he had never before sought to know what thought is or what existence is, still he cannot fail to have a sufficient knowledge of each of these, so that, on this score, he is satisfied. 2. Nor, too, is it possible when someone notices that he thinks and understands what it is to be moved, that he would believe himself to be mistaken, and that he is not thinking but only being moved. For since the idea or notion he has of thought is plainly different from that of corporal motion, it is necessary for him to understand the one to be different from the other. However, on account of his habit of ascribing to one and the same subject many different properties among which no connection is known, it could happen that he doubts or even that he affirms that he is one and the same thing which thinks and which moves from place to place. And one should note that there are two ways in which things of which we have different ideas can be taken to be one and the same thing, namely either by a unity and identity of nature, or merely by a unity of composition. Thus, for example, we surely do not have the same idea of figure in motion, just as we do not have the same idea of the act of understanding and the act of willing, nor of bones and flesh, nor of thought and an extended thing. But nevertheless, we clearly perceive that the very same substance which is able to take on a shape is also capable of being moved, and thus that what has a shape and what is capable of being moved are one and the same thing by virtue of a unity of nature. Likewise, a thing that understands and a thing that wills are also one and the same by virtue of a unity of nature. However, we are not perceiving the same aspect about a thing that we consider under the form of bone, and that we consider under the form of flesh. For this reason, we cannot take them to be one and the same thing by virtue of a unity of nature, but only by virtue of a unity of composition, that is, insofar as it is one and the same animal that has bones and flesh. But the equation before us now is whether we perceive that a thing that thinks and an extended thing are one and the same by virtue of a unity of nature. In other words, do we find between thought and extension the same sort of affinity or connection that we observe between shape and motion, or between the act of understanding and the act of willing? Or rather, are they said to be one and the same merely by virtue of a unity of composition, insofar as they both are found in the same man, just as bones and flesh are found in the same animal? I accept the latter view, since I observe a distinction or difference in every respect between the nature of an extended thing and that of a thing that thinks, which is no less than the difference I observe between bones and flesh. However, you say in addition that no one has as yet been able to grasp my demonstration, lest this conflict, which involves an appeal to authority, be detrimental to the truth. I am forced to reply that while not very many people have as yet examined the demonstration, still there are several who affirm that they understand it. And just as a lone witness who has sailed to America and declares that he has seen the antipodes warrants greater credence than 1,000 others who deny them on the grounds that they have no acquaintance with them, so likewise in the case of those who appropriately examine the weightiness of arguments, greater authority attaches to the one person who says he correctly understands some demonstration than to the thousand others who, without providing any proof, claim that this very same demonstration cannot be understood by anyone. For although they themselves do not understand it, this is no impediment to others being able to understand it. Indeed, by drawing this conclusion on the grounds they do, they show they do not reason with sufficient care and thus do not warrant having very much faith placed in them. Finally, there is the question of whether I have used my method of analysis to dissect all the motions of my subtle matter in such a way that I am certain that I could show people who pay very close attention and who are, to their way of thinking, rather intelligent, that it is self-contradictory for our thoughts to be dispersed among corporal motions. This, as I interpret it, is to say that thoughts and corporal motions are one and the same. My answer to this is that it is indeed most certain to me, but I do not promise that others will be persuaded of it. However attentive and astute they may think they are, at least not so long as they turn their attention not to things purely intelligible, but only to things imaginable, as those people appear to have done who imagined that the distinction between thought and motion is to be understood by way of a dissection of some subtle matter. For this distinction is to be understood solely from the fact that the notion of a thing that thinks and that of an extended or mobile thing are utterly different and independent of one another, and that it is self-contradictory for these things, which are clearly understood by us to be different and independent, not to be able to be established separately, at least by God. Thus, however often we find them in one and the same subject, as for example thought and corporal motion in the same man, we should on that account believe that they are one and the same, not by virtue of a unity, but only by virtue of a unity of composition. 3. What is asserted here regarding the Platonists and their followers has already been rejected by the entire Catholic Church, and commonly by all the philosophers. Now, the Lateran Council did indeed conclude that angels could be depicted pictorially. Nevertheless, it did not on that account grant that angels are corporal. And even if they really were believed to be corporal, their minds certainly cannot be understood to be any more inseparable from angelic bodies than men's minds are from human bodies. And surely, were we here to entertain the notion that a human soul is transmitted to one by one's parents, we cannot therefore conclude that it was corporal, but only that it proceeds from the parent's soul, just as the body arises from the parent's body. As far as dogs and apes are concerned, even if I were to grant that there is thought in them, it would not in any way follow from this that the human mind is not distinct from the body, but rather that in other animals too their minds are distinct from their bodies. This was the position espoused by these very same Platonists, whose authority was just now being praised. In this they were following the Pythagoreans, as is evident from their belief in metempsychosis. However, not only have I declared that there is no thought whatever in brute animals, as is here being assumed by my critics, I also proved it by means of the strongest of arguments that to date have not been refuted by anyone, but actually those who claim that dogs, while awake, know they are running, and even while asleep that they are barking, as if these people were well acquainted with the animals' hearts. Assert this, but do not prove it. For even if they add that they do not believe that the operations of beasts can be explained by means of the science of mechanics without reference to sense, life, and soul, this I take to mean without reference to thought. For I have not denied that there is in brute animals something commonly called life, or a corporal soul, or an organic sense. To the extent that these people are willing to risk everything proving that this position is both impossible and worthy of ridicule. Still, this should not be taken to be a proof, and the same can be said with regard to any other assertion, however true it may be. In fact, people do not usually take risks unless their arguments lack probative force. And since at one time great men mocked claims about the existence of the antipodes in nearly the same way, I believe we should not immediately take to be false what others mock. Finally, there is the added remark. There are plenty of people who will say that man himself has neither sense nor intellect, and that he can do everything by means of mechanical devices and without any mind, given the fact that an ape, a dog, and an elephant can perform all their operations in this way. Yet surely this argument fails to prove anything except perhaps that certain men conceive everything so confusedly and adhere so tenaciously to prematurely formed beliefs, which they understand in merely a verbal fashion, that rather than change them, they deny regarding themselves what they cannot help always experiencing within themselves. For surely we cannot avoid always experiencing within ourselves that we think. It may be shown that brute animals can perform all their operations without any thought, but one should not on that account conclude that therefore one also does not think. The only exception would be someone who has persuaded himself beforehand that he functions in no way different from brute animals, and who, for the sole reason that he ascribes thought to animals, so stolidly adheres to the statement that men and brute animals function in the same way, that, on being shown that brute animals do not think, he prefers to rid himself of that thought of his, of which he cannot fail to be aware, rather than change his opinion that he functions in the same way as brute animals. Nevertheless, I am not easily convinced that there are many men of this sort, but indeed if it be granted that thought is not distinct from corporal motion, there are many more to be found who contend, with much better reason, that it is the same thing that is in brute animals and in us, since they observe all the corporal motions in animals that they find in us. And they add that a difference that is merely a matter of degree does not alter the essence, even though they think perhaps there is less reasoning power in beasts than there is in us. Nevertheless, they quite properly infer that the minds of animals are manifestly in precisely the same species as our own minds. 4. As to the knowledge possessed by an atheist, it is easy to demonstrate that it is not immutable and certain. For, as I have already asserted, the less powerful the atheist imputes the author of his being to be, the greater will be the occasion he will have for questioning whether perhaps he is of so imperfect a nature that he is deceived even in things that seem to him most evident. And he will never be able to free himself of this doubt unless he first recognizes that he has been created by a true God, who cannot deceive. 5. The statement that it is self-contradictory for men to be deceived by God is clearly demonstrated from the fact that the form of deception is non-being, toward which a supreme being cannot tend. And on this point all theologians are in agreement, and on it depends all the certainty of the Christian faith. For why should we believe in things revealed by God if we thought that sometimes we are deceived by Him? And although theologians commonly affirm that the damned are tormented by the fire of hell, still they do not on that account believe that the damned are being deceived by a false idea that God has implanted in them of a tormenting fire, but rather that the damned are truly being tormented by a fire. For, just as the incorporeal spirit of a living man is naturally confined in a body, so too, after death, it can easily be confined in corporal fire through divine power, and so on. However, as to the scripture passages, I do not think it is my place to answer questions about them, except when they appear to be in opposition to some opinion that is unique to me. For when the scriptures are brought to bear against beliefs that are common among all Christians, such as are those that are here being attacked, namely that something can be known, and that human souls are not like that of animals, I be fearful of the charge of arrogance if I did not prefer to be satisfied with the replies that have already been discovered by others, rather than think up new ones, for I have never involved myself in theological studies, except insofar as they contributed to my private instruction, nor do I experience within me sufficient divine grace to believe myself called to these sacred studies. And thus I proclaim that I will not make any replies in the future regarding objections such as these. However, I will not yet adhere to this change in policy, lest perhaps I provide people an occasion for believing that I am silent because I could not provide a sufficiently appropriate explanation. For the passages cited, 6. As for freedom of the will, the account to be given in the case of God is vastly different from the one to be given in our own case. For it is self-contradictory for the will of God not to have been indifferent from all eternity to everything that has happened or ever will happen, since it is impossible to imagine the idea of anything good or true, anything to be believed or to be done or to be left undone being in the divine intellect prior to his will, having determined itself to bring these things about such as they are. Nor am I speaking here of temporal priority. Rather, there is not even a priority of order, or of nature, or of a distinction of reason reasoned. As they say, as if this idea of the good impelled God to choose one thing rather than another. Thus, for example, God did not will to create the world in time because he saw that it would be better this way than were he to have created it from all eternity. Nor did he will that the 3 angles of a triangle should be equal to 2 right angles because he knew that it could not be otherwise, and so on. On the contrary, it is because he willed to create the world in time that it is better than were he to have created it from all eternity. And the fact that it is true and inalterable that the 3 angles of a triangle should necessarily equal 2 right angles is owing to the fact that God willed it to be so. And the same for the other cases. Nor is there any problem in the fact that it could be said that the merits of the saints are the cause of their gaining eternal life, for their merits are not a cause in the sense that they determine God to will something, but merely in the sense that they are the cause of an effect of which God has from all eternity willed their merits to be the cause. And thus God's supreme indifference is the supreme proof of his omnipotence. But as for man, since he finds that the nature of every good and every truth is already determined by God, and that his will could not be directed towards something else, it is evident that he embraces the good and the true the more willingly, and hence also the more freely, according as he sees it more clearly, and that he is never indifferent except when he does not know which alternative is better or truer, or certainly when he does not see it so plainly that he cannot be in doubt regarding it. And thus there is a vast difference between the indifference that pertains to human freedom and the indifference that pertains to divine freedom. Nor is it of any relevance here that the essences of things are said to be indivisible. For first of all, no essence can pertain univocally to God and to a creature. And second, indifference does not pertain to the essence of human freedom, since not only are we free when ignorance of what is right renders us indifferent, but we are also free, and especially so, when a clear perception impels us to pursue something. 7. I conceive of the surface by which I think our senses are affected no differently than all mathematicians and philosophers normally conceive it, or at least ought to conceive it. They distinguish it from the body and suppose that it lacks any depth. However, the word surface is taken in 2 senses by mathematicians. In one sense, they use it to refer to a body to whose length and breadth alone they direct their attention, and that is viewed with our reference to its having any depth. Although they are not denying that it does have some or other depth, in the second sense, they use it merely to refer to a mode of a body, that is, when all its depth is denied, and for this reason, in order to avoid ambiguity, I asserted that I was speaking of that surface, which is merely a mode and hence cannot be a part of a body. For a body is a substance, and a mode cannot be a part of a substance. But I did not deny that the surface is the outer limit of a body. On the contrary, it can just as appropriately be called the outer limit of the contained body, as much as of the body that contains, in the sense in which those bodies are said to be contiguous, whose outer limits are touching one another. For surely when two bodies touch one another, each one's outer limit is one and the same, and this extremity is a part of neither body, but is the same mode of each body, and can remain if these bodies are removed, provided only that other bodies have precisely the same size and shape replace them. In fact, that sort of place which Aristotelians call the surface of a surrounding body cannot be understood to be a surface in any other sense, except in the one in which it is not a substance but a mode. For the position of a tower is not changed even if the air surrounding the tower is changed, or even if some other body is substituted in its place. Thus the surface, which is here taken to be the place, is a part of neither the surrounding air nor the tower. However, in order to reject the reality of accidents, it does not appear to me necessary to demand additional proofs over and above those I have already treated. For first, since every sensation takes place through touch, nothing but the surface of bodies can be sensed. But if there are real accidents, they ought to be something different from that surface, which is merely a mode. Therefore, if they exist, they cannot be sensed. But has anyone ever believed they existed if he did not think they are sensed? Second, it is altogether contradictory that there should be real accidents, since anything real can exist separately from any other subject. But whatever can exist thus separated is a substance, not an accident. Nor is there relevance to the claim that real accidents can be separated from their subjects, not naturally, but only through divine power. For taking place naturally merely means taking place through the ordinary power of God, which in no way differs from God's extraordinary power, and whose impact on the world is no different. Thus, if everything that can exist naturally without a subject is a substance, then whatever can exist without a subject, even if through God's power, however extraordinary it may be, must also be called a substance. Indeed, I do admit that one substance can inhere in another substance, but when this happens, it is not the substance itself that has the form of an accident, but merely the mode of its inherence. For example, when clothing inheres in a man, it is not the clothing itself, but merely the man's state of being clothed, that is, an accident. But since the chief reason which moved philosophers to posit real accidents was that they thought that perceptions of the senses could not be explained without them, I promised that in my writings in physics I would describe this in minute detail, addressing each of the senses one by one. This is not to say that I wanted any of my views to be taken on faith. Rather, I thought that right-thinking people would easily surmise what I could achieve regarding the other senses, given what I have already explained in the dioptrics in regarding to sight. 8. It is evident to anyone who takes note of the immensity of God that there can be absolutely nothing that does not depend on Him. This is true not merely for everything that subsists, but for all order, every law, and every rational basis for what is true and good. For otherwise, as was said a short while ago, God would plainly not have been indifferent to creating the things He created. For if some rational basis for what is good were to have existed prior to God's ordaining of things, this would have determined Him to what was best to do. On the contrary, however, because God has determined Himself toward those things that ought now to be made, they are for that reason, as Genesis has it, very good. In other words, the reason for their goodness depends on the fact that God willed to make them so. Nor is it necessary to inquire in regard to the types of cause it is by which this goodness, or the other truths, both mathematical as well as metaphysical, depend upon God. For since those who enumerated the types of causes perhaps did not pay attention to this type of causing, it is hardly any wonder that they gave no name to it. In fact, however, they did give a name to it. It could be called an efficient cause, and for the same reason that a king is the one who puts a law into effect, even though the law is not itself something existing physically, but is merely a moral being, as they say. Nor too is it necessary to ask how God could have been able to bring it about from all eternity that it not be true that twice 4 is 8, and so on. For I admit that this cannot be understood by us. On the other hand, however, I rightly understand that there can be nothing in any class of being which does not depend upon God, and that it would have been easy for God to establish certain things such that we men would not understand that these things could be otherwise than they are. Thus it would be illogical to doubt something we correctly understand because of something we neither understand nor observe any reason why we should understand it. Hence, we should not think that eternal truths depend upon the human intellect or upon other existing things. Rather, they depend on God alone, who, as supreme legislator, has established them from all eternity. 9. For us to observe correctly what sort of certainty belongs to sense, we must distinguish 3 levels, as it were, within it. To the first pertains only that by which the corporal organ is immediately affected by external objects, and this can only be the motion of the particles of the organ in question, and the change in configuration and position resulting from that motion. The second level includes everything that immediately results in the mind from its being united to the corporal organ that is thus affected. And such are the perceptions of sorrow, tickling, thirst, hunger, colors, sound, taste, smell, heat, cold, and the like, which arise from the union and, as it were, the intermingling of mind and body, as was asserted in the 6th meditation. Finally, the third level includes all those judgments we have been accustomed to make from our youth regarding things outside us, on the occasion of motions in the corporal organs. For example, when I see a stick, one should not think that some intentional species wing their way from stick to the eye, but merely that rays of light reflected from the stick excite certain motions in the optic nerve and, by this means, in the brain. As I have explained at sufficient length in the Dioptrics, and it is in this motion of the brain, which we have in common with brute animals, that the first level of sensing consists, but from this there follows the second level of sensing that extends only to the perception of color or light reflected from the stick. It arises from the fact that the mind is so intimately conjoined with the brain that it is affected by the motions which take place in it, and nothing else is to be assigned to sense. If we wish to distinguish it carefully from the intellect, for it is on the basis of this sensation of color by which I am affected that I judge a stick existing outside me has color, and it is on the basis of the extension of this color, its boundaries, and relation of its position to the parts of my brain, that I draw conclusions regarding the stick's size, shape, and distance. And this is the case even though people commonly attribute these 2 activities to sense. And were I therefore here to assign them to the third level of sensing, still it is manifest that it depends upon the intellect alone. And I have demonstrated in the Dioptrics that size, distance, and shape can be perceived only by reasoning from one of these aspects to another. But the difference lies solely in the fact that when we make judgments now for the first time on account of some new observation, we attribute them to the intellect. But as to those judgments we made from our earliest years, made in precisely the same way as the ones we make now, concerning things which affected our senses, or even things to which we concluded by means of a process of reasoning, we assigned them to sense. And we made this assignment because habit makes us reason and judge very quickly. Or rather, we recall judgments we had for a long time been making regarding similar things, and thus we fail to distinguish these operations from a simple perception of sense. Thus, it is evident that when we declare that the certainty of the intellect is far greater than that of the senses, we mean merely that the judgments we make as adults as a result of new observations are more certain than those we formed in early childhood without any reflection at all. No doubt this is true, for it is obvious that it is not a question here of the first and second levels of sensing, since there cannot be any falsity in it. Hence, when it is asserted that a stick in water appears broken on account of refraction, this is the same as saying that how it appears to us is the basis on which a child would judge it to be broken, and even the basis on which we make the same judgment in accordance with the preconceived opinions with which we have become accustomed from our youth. But I cannot grant what is added here, namely, that this error is corrected by touch and not by the intellect. The reason is that even though it is through touch that we judge the stick to be straight, this judgment taking place in the same way as that to which we have been accustomed from infancy, and which therefore is called sense. Nevertheless, this does not suffice to correct an error of sight. On the contrary, in addition, we need to have some power of reasoning to teach us that in this matter we ought to give more credence to a judgment based on touch than to a judgment elicited from sight. Since this power of reasoning has not been in us from our infancy, it must be ascribed not to sense but to the intellect alone. And therefore in this very case it is the intellect alone that corrects an error of sense, and no instance can ever be brought forward in which error results from our trusting the operation of the mind more than sense. 10. Since the difficulties that remain are put forward more as doubts than as objections, I am not so arrogant that I would dare to reply that I will provide a satisfactory account for those difficulties, concerning which to this day I see men of great intelligence and learning have doubts. Still, so that I might perform to my capacity and that I not fail in my cause, I will candidly state how it happened that I completely freed myself from these same doubts, for thus I will be delighted if perhaps these same things be used by others, but if not, at least I will not be aware of any rashness on my part. When I first made a real distinction between the human mind and the body on the basis of arguments displayed in these meditations, and inferred that the mind is more known than the body, and so on, I surely was compelled to give my assent, because I observed nothing in them that was incoherent, or that was not deduced from evident principles according to the rules of logic. But I confess I was not for that reason fully convinced, and the same thing happened to me that happens to astronomers who, after having been won over by arguments that the sun is several times larger than the earth, still cannot bring themselves to judge that the sun is not smaller than the earth, when they are actually turning their eyes towards it. But I advanced further and passed over to a consideration of physical things by placing my trust in the same basic principles. I did this first by attending to the ideas or notions of anything at all that I found within myself. I diligently distinguished them one from the other, so that all my judgments would be congruent with them. As a result, I observed that absolutely nothing belongs to the concept of a body, except that it is something which has length, breadth, and depth, and that it is capable of various shapes and motions. I also found that these shapes and motions are merely modes which no power could cause to exist apart from a body. But colors, smells, tastes, and the like are merely certain sensations existing in my thought, differing no less from bodies than does pain from the shape or motion of the weapon that is inflicting the pain. Finally, I observed that heaviness, hardness, the power of heating, attracting, and purging, and all the other qualities we experience in bodies consist exclusively in motion or the privation of motion, and the configuration and arrangement of their parts. Since these opinions differ considerably from those that I had previously held regarding physical things, I then began to consider the reasons why I had previously believed otherwise, and I observed that the chief reason was that, beginning from infancy, I had made various judgments regarding physical things, insofar as they aided in the preservation of the life I was entering, and I later retained the same opinions I had previously conceived. And since at that age the mind used the corporal organs less properly and was very firmly attached to them, it did not do any thinking apart from them, and perceived things only in a confused fashion. And although it was conscious of its own nature, and possessed within itself an idea of thought as well as an idea of extension, nevertheless, since it understood nothing without also at the same time imagining something, it took them both to be one and the same, referring to the body all the notions it had of things that are related to the intellect. And since I never freed myself later in life from these preconceived opinions, I did not know anything at all with enough distinctness, and I assumed that everything was corporal, even though I assumed that the ideas or concepts of these very things which I took to be corporal were often such that they referred to minds rather than to bodies. For I conceived of heaviness, for example, as if it were a certain real quality that is present in solid bodies. Although I called it a quality, referring it to the bodies in which it inhered, nevertheless, by adding that it was real, I actually thought it was a substance. In the same way, clothing, taken in itself, is a substance, even though when referred to the man who is clothed, it is a quality. And again, the mind, even though it is really a substance, can nevertheless still be called a quality of the body to which it is joined. And although I imagined that heaviness is diffused throughout the entire body that is heavy, still I did not ascribe to it that very same extension which constitutes the nature of a body. For the true extension of a body is such that it excludes any mutual penetrability of its parts. However, I thought there was as much heaviness in a 10-foot long piece of wood as there was in a 1-foot long bar of gold or some other metal. In fact, I judged that all the heaviness could be contracted to a mathematical point. Indeed, I also saw that heaviness, while remaining coextensive with the body that is heavy, could exert its entire force in any part of the body. For if the body were suspended by a rope, it could pull on the rope with all its force, just as if this heaviness were only in the part touching the rope and were not diffused throughout the remaining parts, regardless of the part to which the rope might be attached. And it is in precisely this way that surely I now understand the mind to be coextensive with the body, the whole of the mind in the whole body, and the whole mind in every one of its parts. But it appears that the belief that this idea of heaviness was drawn from the one I had of the mind is chiefly attributable to the fact that I believed that heaviness carried bodies toward the center of the earth, as if it contained within itself some knowledge. For this certainly could not take place without knowledge, nor could any knowledge occur unless it be in a mind. Nevertheless, I also used to attribute a few other properties to heaviness that cannot be understood to be attributable in the same way to a mind. For example, that it is divisible, measurable, and so on. But after I had taken sufficient note of these things, I carefully distinguished the idea of the mind from the ideas of the body and corporal motion, and I came to realize that all the other ideas of real qualities or substantial forms which I had formerly possessed had been put together or fabricated by me from those previously mentioned ideas. Thus I easily freed myself from all the doubts that have been proposed here. For first of all, I had no doubt about whether I possessed a clear idea of my mind, inasmuch as I had an intimate awareness of it, Nor did I have any doubt about whether this idea was utterly different from the ideas of other things, and about whether it contained anything corporal. For although I had sought true ideas of these other things as well, and I seemed to know all of them in a general sort of way, still I utterly failed to find anything in them that was not completely different from the idea of the mind. And I saw that there is a far greater distinction between things such as mind and body, which appeared distinct even though I thought attentively about both of them, than there is between things that are such that when we think of both of them, we do not see that one of these can exist apart from the other, despite the fact that we can understand one while not thinking about the other. Thus the immensity of God can readily be understood even if no attention is given to his justice. But if attention is given to both, it is utterly self-contradictory for us to think that God is immense but not just. Moreover, the existence of God can also be rightly understood, even if one were ignorant of the persons of the Holy Trinity, inasmuch as they can be perceived only by a mind illumined by faith. But when they have been perceived, I deny that a real distinction can be understood to obtain among them by reason of the divine essence, although it may be allowed by reason of their relations to one another. And finally, I was not fearful about my being obsessed about my method of analysis, or about having made an error, when, because I saw that there are certain bodies that do not think, or rather because I clearly understood that certain bodies can exist without thought, I preferred to argue that thought does not belong to the nature of the body, rather than conclude that thought is a mode of the body, on the grounds that there are certain other bodies, human bodies, for example, which do think. For I have never really seen or perceived that human bodies think, but merely that it was the same men who possess both thought and a body. And I observed that this occurs as a result of combining a thing that thinks with a something corporal, because in examining by itself a thing that thinks, I observed nothing in it that belonged to the body, just as I observed no thought in corporal nature when I considered it by itself. On the contrary, however, in examining all the modes of body and mind, I observed absolutely nothing whose concept did not depend on the concept of the thing of which it was a mode. Because we often see two things joined together, one should not conclude that they are one and the same. But because we sometimes observe one of them apart from the other, it is quite appropriate to draw the inference that they are different. Nor should the power of God deter us from drawing this inference, since it is no less contradictory in its very concept that what we clearly perceive to be two different things should become one and the same, intrinsically, and not through a combination, then that things which are in no way distinct should be separated. And thus, if God were to bestow upon certain bodies the power of thinking, as in fact he has done in the case of human bodies, he can decouple this very power from them, and thus it is no less really distinct from them. Nor do I marvel at the fact that at one time, before I had freed myself from the preconceived opinions of the senses, it surely was the case that I perceived rightly that 2 and 3 make 5, and that when equals are subtracted from equals the remainders are equal, and many similar examples, since nevertheless I did not believe that the soul of a man is distinct from his body. For it is easy for me to observe that it did not happen that while I was still just a young child, I would make a false judgment regarding those propositions that everyone equally admits, for at that time they were not yet of any use to me. Nor do children learn to count 2 and 3 before they are capable of judging whether they make 5, and so on. On the contrary, however, from my infancy I had conceived of mind and body as one single thing, for my observation that I was composed of mind and body was confused, and it occurs in nearly every instance of imperfect knowledge that many things are grasped simultaneously, as if they were one thing, but that later on must be distinguished by means of a more careful scrutiny. And that is the end of the objections.